Blog Talk Radio.
And welcome to Outside the Huddle Sports Talk Radio, presented by Huddling with the Pros. I'm David Weinstein, Huddling with the Pros legal analyst and an attorney at Clark Silverglate in Miami, Florida. Joining me tonight are my co-host Champ Jordan and Huddling with the Pros sports columnist Bill Gutman. Bill and Champ will be joining me in just a minute. We have a lot to talk about tonight, especially during our Hot Topics segment, where we will be joined by Linda Robertson, our special guest and a sports reporter for the Miami Herald. We'll be discussing Cuba and Major League Baseball with Linda. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about our show. Outside the Huddle airs live every Wednesday evening from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern. The goal of our show is to take on all the important and controversial sports issues head on. We'd love to hear from you, so post your questions on our Twitter and Facebook pages at hashtag AskHWTP Sports Talk Radio, or email us at sportstalkradio@huddlin, HUDDLIN, withthepros.com. We're also on Instagram at HuddlinWThePros. Tonight's hot topic is whether or not the changes in the relationship between the United States and Cuba are going to have an effect on Major League Baseball. To help us out with this discussion, we're being joined by a special guest, Linda Robertson. Linda has been a reporter at the Miami Herald since 1983. She writes sports features and columns and has covered both the Winter and Summer Olympics beat. Linda, thank you so much for taking some time out on a Wednesday evening and joining us.
Sure, I'm glad to be here.
Linda, I saw the story when it first cropped up at the end of the year. It was in connection with a series of articles you had written in the Herald on both the change in the policy that was taking place, as well as human trafficking and some of the smuggling that resulted on how some of the players got here. Bill, before we launch into our discussion about the change in relations and how that's going to affect us, for those of us that aren't quite as familiar with baseball, I mean, the history of baseball in Cuba dates back all the way to the early 1900s, and in fact, before 1950 and the souring of the relations, there was a live and living baseball culture both in Cuba as well as players coming here. If maybe you could give us just a couple of minutes about that so we could have a historical perspective before we look forward and see how things are going to change.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Linda. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Okay. I just wanted to mention that in the early days of the 20th century, when baseball was operating under the color line, which prohibited any African-American or black players to play in the game, there were some Cuban-born players that came into baseball simply because they were white. And from what I read, the Caucasian Cubans had to prove a pure European ancestry, and then they were allowed to play, which is kind of interesting that this whole dynamic existed. But there were a couple of early players that are very interesting to hear about. There was a player named Miguel Angel Gonzalez who debuted with the Boston Braves in 1912 and played 17 years in the majors. He only had a .253 batting average. He wasn't a star, but he later became a St. Louis Cardinals coach, and in 1938, for a period of time, was their interim manager. So he was the first Latin American manager in baseball, and he was Cuban, and that happened in 1938. And then there was a pitcher named Adolph Luque, Luque, and he was the first real Latin American star, and they say he was a pitcher. He played from 1914 to 1935 with Boston, Cincinnati, Brooklyn, and the New York Giants. He was Havana-born, and he won 194 games, lost 179, had a 27-8 record in 1923. So he was a real big star. They said he was a very tough, aggressive, often vulgar guy, and typical of the players in that era, just a real scrapper. and a guy who made it. He's not in the Hall of Fame, but he had a very, very good career. And in 1924, for instance, he made $12,000 playing baseball. So you had that. And then, of course, going into the 1950s, you had some very fine Cuban players. You had Minnie Minoso, who played 5 different decades. He got a couple of at-bats when he was an old man, almost as a publicity stunt. You had a couple of pitchers with the Washington Senators, Camilo Pascual and Pedro Ramos. And these guys came into baseball before the Castro Revolution, which I believe was 1959, and that's when it started to slow down. But there were some other fine Cuban players that came in after that. Tony Perez, Luis Tiant. Tony Perez is the only Cuban-born player in the Hall of Fame. Tony Oliva. So Cubans did have a pretty much illustrious history in Major League Baseball until it stopped for a while, and then, of course, they started defecting on their own. At first, when the team was traveling in foreign countries, they would leave the team. And, of course, it got to a point where the money got big, and this is what Linda's going to talk about, people actually smuggling the players out of Cuba. So that's a brief little history. I just found it interesting that in the early days they would let white Cubans play and not black Cubans, which is, again, that crazy color line that messed up baseball for so long.
Well, except for Canadians, Major League Baseball allows foreign nationals to negotiate as free agents with any club, but the embargo that's in place by the United States against Cuba prohibits Cuban players from negotiating as a free agent while they're still in Cuba, and those who defect to the U.S. Have to enter the amateur draft. Linda, if I can, let me ask you, in your experience and from what you've seen, how do most Cuban players make it to the U.S. and go through that process to end up on a Major League roster?
Well, it behooves them to become free agents. So in order to do that, they've got to go to a third country, establish residency there. It's a very convoluted process. They get declared a free agent by Major League Baseball because now they're no longer a resident of Cuba. They're a resident of the Dominican Republic or Mexico or Haiti. And then they get a license from the Office for Foreign Assets Control. And then they can be a free agent, free to negotiate the most lucrative deal they can get with all the teams. So their goal is to get to one of these third countries and establish residency there.
Well, it would seem to me, at least, that inherent in that whole process is the fact that a Cuban has to establish residency in a third country. It would seem to almost sort of foster some sort of illegal human smuggling venture and require that some sort of criminal element get involved. Do you think that by overturning the embargo that's going to stop these people from using the human trafficking route to become a free agent?
Yes. I mean, first of all, if the Cuban players came directly to the United States, then they, like the Canadians, they would have to enter the amateur draft and make a lot less money. And one argument that's been made is, well, why does Major League Baseball just let them get to the U.S. and become free agents? But Major League Baseball is hesitant to do that because then they fear Canadians and U.S. collegiate players would sue and say, well, why do they get this privilege while we don't? I mean, the whole thing is there's just so many pitfalls, no matter which way you look at trying to resolve it. Now, if they're able to eventually eliminate the embargo, which is going to be a whole nother long and difficult process given the politics of our country, then yes, I think the smugglers would be cut out of the equation altogether, because then, the Cuban players in theory would be just like a Venezuelan player or Dominican player, where they don't need to escape their country or, pretend that they're from another country. They'd just be like another, foreign player.
Well, speaking of foreign players, the Dominicans, the Mexicans, the Japanese players, how are those players getting here? How are they negotiating contracts? What sort of money is changing hands, either with the teams that they were playing for in their native countries or with the players themselves that are letting them come in as free agents?
Well, they don't. We don't have the special rules for that Major League Baseball has for Cubans because of our lack of a normal relationship with Cuba. so they are just like everybody else. Now, in the case of the Asian players, that's interesting, and that could affect how Cuba eventually deals with Major League Baseball, because as I understand it, the Asian teams basically charge it's almost like a negotiation fee or a release fee for their players, where the Asian, like the Japanese team, would then get a cut of that fee, and they would allow their star pitcher to negotiate with the Red Sox, for example. And some people have said they could foresee that as sort of an interim way for Cuba, which treats its players as it treats everyone, as a government employee. So Cuba and its sports ministry would, in theory, be able to get a cut of these deals, because they consider these players to be their assets. So that could be a development that you might see down the road, and as a way to satisfy the Cuban government's desires in regard to their players, and allow them to get to the major leagues.
As strange as it might. Yes, Bill.
Yeah, could I say something about that? I think the Japanese had what they call a posting system, and I believe a Japanese player has to play a certain number of years in Japan before he can become a free agent on his own. If he expresses a desire to play in the major leagues, his team, the Japanese team, has to has to agree to post him. And until last year, they had a system where a major league teams interested would give sealed bids, and the largest bidder would get the rights to negotiate with the player. I know when the Red Sox signed Daisuke Matsuzaka some years ago, they bid $52 million just to talk to him, and they paid him another $52. They had a month to come to an agreement. If they can't, the posting fee is returned and the player stays in Japan. Last year with Masahiro Tanaka, they set the ceiling at $20 million, and I believe 6 teams bid to negotiate with him, so they changed it a little bit. And he had a chance to negotiate with 6 teams before he picked the Yankees. So instead of one team winning, now multi-teams can go in at a ceiling of $20 million, which is, again, given to the Japanese team. So, yeah, I agree with Linda that Cuba could do something like that, and everyone's going to look to make money out of these players one way or the other. So if a Cuban team's going to lose a good player, they're going to want to make money just as the Japanese teams do.
Linda, are there enough quality players still left in the Cuban leagues that would make something like that, a posting, work where there's going to be enough demand, or has Cuban baseball really diminished from what it was 10, even 15 years ago, and there's just not enough quality left in the league due to all the defections that have been taking place with no benefit really going back to Cuba?
Well, there's definitely been a dilution of talent. Let's say, for example, 5 players from Cuba's 2013 World Baseball Classic squad left the island shortly thereafter. And, you've seen these huge contracts signed in the last 5 years or so by, Puig and Abreu and Cespedes. The people that I interviewed, agents and scouts, they feel that there's about a half a dozen players left on the island who could have a Abreu-like impact. Maybe not quite as great as his, but they would have an immediate impact on Major League Baseball. They would be, first-tier players. The problem is that a couple of those guys have had many chances to leave, and the consensus is that they never will. They're loyal to Cuba for, personal reasons, family reasons, maybe philosophical reasons. So a guy like Yulieski Gurriel, who's probably the best guy, third baseman there, will probably never leave. A guy like Alfredo Despaigne will probably never leave. They recently suspended and detained their best second baseman, who's kind of regarded as like the number 3 prospect there, Jose Fernandez. And then also recently, 3 of their second basemen, sort of like 3 generations of second basemen, have all left in succession, and they're all right now doing, showcases and tryouts, and on the verge of signing. So yes, the drain has been consistent and painful. Now, then you can also make the argument that, Cuba is to baseball players as Brazil is to soccer players, and they're never going to stop producing great baseball players in a place where it's so ingrained in the culture. It just might be a case where the interest is in the sort of the younger players that would be more likely to go into the minor leagues and have to be developed before they could, step up to a major league roster.
So getting back to the potential that relations could change and dollars could start entering Cuba and hands could start changing, do you ever envision, and this is certainly going to be a time down the road, where relations normalize and you end up with either minor league teams that are playing in Cuba or potentially even one or two teams who call Cuba home and compete in Major League Baseball like you have teams in Canada?
I think that would be a marvelous idea. I think you could take the Tampa Bay Rays and put them in Havana right now, and they'd get a much more rabid following. You might have trouble charging the same concession prices there, but I think that would be. I think that's like, if you look, to some sort of utopian world, there would be a couple or one or two major league teams in Cuba, and the Cuban people would be ecstatic. I mean, there'd be no question that they would embrace that. And I think the other thing that we could see is, the academy system flourishing down there as it does in the Dominican, for example. So you've got this country that's 90 miles away from Key West. You've got a league that is always looking to, globalize, just like all the pro sports leagues now. They're holding NFL games in England every year, and the NBA has got its assortment of foreign stars and a huge following in China, for example. So here's a chance for baseball, to expand its reach. Of course, the negative would be that it's a very poor island, and, how much money could you be expecting to make there?
Getting back to the Japanese leagues and the Mexican leagues, here are two other countries where they have a system of baseball that sort of flourishes there. Certainly in Japan, they're making money. I understand the economic conditions in Japan are far superior to those in Cuba. Do you think that with a little influx, again, assuming that the embargo is lifted and money starts flowing, do you think with a little more influx of money, there would actually be a revitalization of the Cuban leagues, and they would be able to prop themselves up to not only stimulate the interest in baseball, develop the talent, but potentially sort of put them in a position where they're competing with Major League Baseball?
I don't know if I'd take it quite that far, but I see where you're going. I think that one thing that Cuba would definitely be open to, and for example, Fidel's son Tony Castro, who's a physician who's very involved with the national team, has floated the idea of having like foreign investors own the teams of Cuba's national league, and try to invest in those teams. The stadiums, are in very poor shape. Equipment is at a premium there. Latino America Stadium, for a while, they couldn't have night games because they couldn't afford to turn on the lights. And they're always looking for hard currency in Cuba. So I think that's something that they would really be enthused about, is maybe some Spanish investors or Canadian investors or eventually American investors, like you see with the English Premier League, for example. Owning and upgrading the teams and the league, and to the point where it could I don't know if it would compete with Major League Baseball, but it would certainly be an attractive league.
Again, I want to remind everybody out there you're listening to Outside the Huddle Sports Talk Radio with me, David Weinstein, Champ Jordan, Bill Gutman, and our special guest, Linda Robertson from the Miami Herald. We're talking Cuba and baseball. Linda, should Major League Baseball take a public position on the topic? Should they be encouraging the United States to normalize relations so they can get the ball rolling, or should they just remain silent on the sidelines?
Well, I mean, I would take the stance that they should take a leadership position here, that they could be using sports as diplomacy. I mean, look what happened with ping pong diplomacy and our relations with China when Nixon was president. I mean, if Major League Baseball really wanted to, show some leadership and vision, they could come out and, the commissioner could make an interesting statement about the power of sports, and this is something that these two countries have in common, a passion that our peoples share. You have this talent that's just dying to be showcased, and so I think, it would take a real leader, though, and somebody with some guts to do that, and we haven't seen that from Major League Baseball. They will rarely even comment on this issue, which is one of the biggest headaches facing them today, is what to do about the Cuban pipeline. They shy away from it. They've had chances to, have a forum or, get their committees going on some sort of international draft or some way to change the rules, deal with the State Department, the Treasury Department, and they just haven't done it. They always say that their hands are tied by the embargo and by our nation's stance toward Cuba, and they shrug their shoulders and say, there's nothing we can do.
Well, we've got a new commissioner who may be willing to make it his legacy. We've got a president who's willing to open up the conversation and who is going to bring this to the forefront. Bill, I know you've got a question or a comment you wanted to throw in.
Yeah, I got a couple of comments to make. I don't think there'll ever be a dearth of talent coming out of the Latin American countries for a number of reasons. One, I've done a number of books on Latin American players, and I know these kids down there, they start to play baseball early. They'll play with cardboard as a glove and roll up tinfoil to have a ball. So it's not only the national sport, but now that they're seeing the money that they can make by becoming major leaguers, just like college players here in football and basketball have the dream of going pro. I think more and more of these kids are just going to keep playing baseball. And if the best players leave, and the best players have certainly left the Dominican Republic, there's more Latin American Dominicans in the majors than any other country from Latin America, and they're still producing good players after good players. So I think that's going to continue. I also wanted to mention they have the World Baseball Classic every few years now where the Cubans have participated and won it one year. So all the countries play in the World Baseball Classic, and they compete in different countries, including the United States. But ironically, Major League Baseball I don't think is that hot on it because several big-name players have gotten hurt participating in the World Baseball Classic, which takes place I believe in March before the regular baseball season starts. So some of the better players from the United States are shying away from playing in that. But the World Baseball Classic is something that certainly would help all these countries showcase their teams and their top players and their talent. So there are a few things at play as far as baseball going international. Whether they'll expand to other countries, I don't know. That would take a lot.
Linda, you touched on it before. Some of the quality players who are still there, who have had opportunities in the past and don't want to leave and have sort of had this pride about staying in Cuba and still playing baseball there. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to talk to any of the people who actually get to talk to them, but do you think that if something could be put in place where these players could feel sort of a pride in helping to bring money back to their country by exporting their skills and going and playing abroad and coming back, do you think that would change the way they feel about it, or do you think that they just have such a strong tie to the island that no matter what happens, they'll feel they're abandoning the people they left behind?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think we have an answer in that the Cuban sports ministry, in its desire to make some money off of these incredible assets, have allowed them to be rented out to first Mexican and now primarily Japanese teams. And there were 3 guys who were making about $1 million with the Japanese league. The only requirement was that they come back in time to play the Cuban Serie Nacional, which is the Cuban league season. So they, in a way, they got the best of both worlds because they got a chance to go away, play in a more competitive, I guess it would be a more competitive league, and then make some money. Of course, the Cuban government takes 80% of that money, but when you're making $40 a month, then a couple $100,000 is a lot of money, and still play for their home team. Everybody plays for their home province. Play for the national team in international events. And if, someday, some way, Cuban players are allowed to play in Major League Baseball, these loyalists might also have the best of both worlds where they could still, come back home and live part of the year at home. Now, the big problem is that the Major League team would probably prohibit a player from playing, in the wintertime. That used to be allowed. I mean, if you think about the winter leagues that used to thrive, but now there's such fear of injury and salaries are so high, and there's so much risk of losing your value, that they would probably restrict them from playing for the Cuban league, even part-time. So I don't know, the way they set it up where they kind of allowed these guys to be rented out and play a few months overseas seemed to placate some of those desires, to make more money. But for some of these guys, staying in Cuba is something that they've just decided to do. And for you and me, it's easy to say, take the money and run, but for someone who is very close to their families, very close to their homeland, it's a tough decision to just abandon that all. And sometimes you don't get to see your family for years. So, they've decided they'd rather stay.
Well, Linda, we want to thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. You have given us a lot of insight on the whole topic. But before we let you go, Champ, do you have anything that's on your mind that you want to ask Linda before we wrap things up?
No, Bill stole a couple of my questions, so I'm going to sit this one out.
Bill, have you got any others?
Yeah, I just want to mention that there are still young players that go play in the winter leagues, either AAA players that are going to try to make the team, or a player that's been injured and didn't play much during the season may go down and play a little bit in the winter leagues. And actually, a few of the big stars will go down and maybe play for a couple of weeks just to play in front of their home crowd. So that's done. As far as players not wanting to leave Cuba, I'm always reminded of the story of Teofilo Stevenson, who was a great Cuban heavyweight fighter in the 1960s and won about 3 Olympic gold medals, and they were begging this guy to turn pro because they wanted him to fight Muhammad Ali. He was a big, handsome-looking guy. He could have been a big star, and he would not leave Cuba. He remained an amateur, and he said, I'd rather have 8 million people cheering for me and loving me in Cuba than having $1 million. So there was a case of a guy who just didn't want to leave the homeland, and, of course, Castro was in power then, and he was their big star.
They've had track stars and, volleyball stars, a lot of athletes,
great athletes. Absolutely great athletes.
You can't fault them for believing in an ideal, no matter how it may have curdled over the years, and for being, true to their home country. You can't hold that against them.
No, and certainly back then communism was still, the philosophy in Russia and China, so it was fresher then, and the country was I don't think in the condition of poverty that it's fallen into the last several decades.
Right, there was great hope that this would bring about a much more equal society on that island.
Linda, if you had to make a suggestion to Major League Baseball as a way to not be as vocal as they should be about it, but sort of working behind the scenes, what would you tell them they should do to sort of develop the philosophy that needs to take a grip here and sort of move things along?
Well, it is, given the political realities, we have a Congress that's at odds with the president, no matter what initiatives he's going to try to take for the remainder of his term. But I think one thing Major League Baseball is they could appoint some sort of liaison, some visionary guy who has shown leadership qualities in the past. I mean, they've done this before, with different commissions and when they've been dealing with the steroid problem and what have you. Appoint a liaison who could, really get his hands dirty in talking to our politicians, people in the State Department, people in Cuba's sports ministry, people in the Cuban government. And because I think there's a willingness on all sides to make something happen. Everyone can benefit if Cuban players are playing in the major leagues. It's just sort of, how do you do it? How do you handle the logistics of it? And do you have the will to pull it off? So appoint a liaison, like a diplomat, sort of ambassador person who could just has the freedom to hold talks and maybe, discussions behind the scenes and see what they could work out. Because I think you might find the doors would open more quickly than you might expect.
Sounds like a very good suggestion, and I hope that somebody who's out there listening heard that. I'm sure that there are plenty of former professional players, ball players, who'd be willing to step into that role and who would like to expand the game. We have a new commissioner who's here who, can set his own legacy, set him apart, and maybe make this all happen. Linda, we can't thank you enough for joining us. We really appreciate it. I would be amiss as my job as part of any sports talk show that had a guest on right before the Super Bowl not to ask you who you think is going to win the game on Sunday before we let you go.
I'm going to go with the Patriots.
All right, so you evened it up. There you go. You got a 2-2 here. Thanks again, Linda. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. Have a good evening.
Great show. It was very engaging. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for coming on. Champ or Bill, you have any last comments you want to make before we break away for the week?
I just wanted to ask a question. If you guys, I know they have a lot of, prop bets, for the Super Bowl. I was wondering, do you think there's going to be a prop bet if there will be any footballs that are underinflated?
I think there is one, and I think you could probably get good odds on it. I think the PSI on that is under 12.5.
I'd definitely put some money on that. I'm pretty sure there will be some heavy security checking those balls.
All right.
And maybe a few signs in the stands from fans about the balls being deflated, directed
at
Brady.
If they don't get confiscated before. Well, just as a reminder, everybody, Outside the Huddle is presented by Huddlin' with the Pros and airs live every Wednesday evening from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern. The show is produced by Jacqueline Park and is a Hyacinth Communications production. Be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Special thanks to our special guest, Linda Robertson, and as always to our great Huddlin' with the Pros team, Madison Carter, Champ Jordan, Bill Gutman, and Danina DePool. If you want to hear more from Champ Jordan, check out his new radio show called Champ and Guns on Blog Talk Radio. Good night, everyone. Enjoy the Super Bowl, and we'll see you next week.